right. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm confident you will be glad you are here today. We have two amazing educators with us today, Dr. Jana Gerard and Dr. Trudy Giasi. Dr. Gerard is the coordinator of the Evolution Center and an adjunct faculty member at Southeast Missouri State University. Jana ensures that teacher candidates are prepared to effectively and appropriately implement educational technology in their future classrooms by providing instruction on digital literacy, competency, and citizenship through the lens of the ISTE standards for educators. Jana also provides students, faculty, and staff professional development on design thinking, coding, 3D printing, and virtual and augmented reality. Jana is an ISTE certified educator, a Google certified educator, trainer, and coach, an Apple teacher and learning coach, Microsoft certified educator, Microsoft innovative educator, a DFID ambassador, and an Ozobot certified educator. Dr. Trudy Giasi is currently the principal at Valley Catholic Schools within the Archdiocese of St. Louis. Dr. Giasi brings a wealth of experience to the field of education, having served in numerous roles, including classroom teacher, district science/STEM coordinator, university professor, and professional development provider. She has been instrumental in developing STEM education programming, curriculum design, standards, assessment, and partnerships across school districts, universities, and state and national levels. She has a PhD in STEM education, an MA in educational administration, an MED in science education, and a BFA in dance from The Ohio State University, a woman after my own heart. I'll give the rest of our time today to them, and let me stop sharing so that you can start sharing. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Jen, for that amazing introduction. We are going to share some resources today. So here on this slide, we have the QR code and the URL if you would like to grab these slides. And there will be another opportunity to grab this if you need it. So just in case we have some people new to Ozobot, really quickly, an Ozobot is a small programmable robot, and it's really great because it's easy to learn how to use, and kids really like it, and it's very collaborative. And it allows you to teach multiple subjects as well as computational thinking and problem solving and those 4 C's of future ready learning. And then how does it work? You have two different choices for how you code with an Ozobot. You can do the color codes, and there's multiple ways to use the color codes, or you can use the Ozoblockly, and there's multiple systems you can use the Ozoblockly on. And if needed, it can be screen-free using those color codes. So, one of the things Trudy and I talked about is why is Ozobot different than a lot of those other educational technology tools out there? And I think one of the big ways it's different is you spend less instruction time on teaching students how to use Ozobots because it's a pretty user-friendly and intuitive design. It is also very accessible to students who've never really spent a lot of time coding, and it's very accessible to students who may have diverse ways of learning. So with that said, I am going to hand it over to Trudy.
Okay, so we're gonna start with getting a little bit more information from you because we have these acronyms, the STEM, the STEAM, the STREAM, there's STEAMMA. I've heard so many different versions. And I think what we're interested in, because this plays a role in how we think about using technology tools and when and where we're going to use those. Can you in the chat put in, do you at your institution or your context, do you use one of these? And if you don't, say no, we don't use any of those terms. It's like we might do some of this in our class because I think we're going to probably see a mix of all of it. And if you look around the country, we could get Yep, I see computer science. I see not using any terms at all. STEM, STEAM. Oh, that's an interesting. Oh, I love it. The STEAM, since we're French board. Yes. And so we have these terms that kind of, in a way, define how we approach it. So science, technology, engineering, math. The A is typically for the arts. In a stream model, art could be reading, art could be research, art could be in a religious setting, religion. I've seen that model everywhere. And I think what I'm going to have Jana do real quick, we've been kind of working with teachers and other professionals on maybe another way to think about the acronym. So we're also going to talk about not using the acronym at all and getting rid of the labels and just talk about good teaching. But if you are doing a STEAM model, we're starting to see this branch out, not just the arts, but maybe some like fine arts, maybe some other arts. So Jana, you want to talk a little bit about that
So
perspective?
yeah, I come from a librarian and ELA background. And so for me, I was always like, wait, the arts don't have to be like fine arts. It doesn't have to be performing arts or visual arts. There can be a lot of other arts. And so really, what's been interesting is to see how much more that A is expanded into being more arts and humanities. And one of the things that we're really looking at is, if we want to make sure we're addressing ethics and, looking at writing and reading and, then, maybe not just thinking of it as fine arts, but having that broader idea of what the arts are, maybe looking at it more from a humanities perspective.
So just something to consider as you have your, whether you get it, you get to define it for your school or help with that, or if your school has somebody do that for you. I mean, that's something you probably can't always touch. But when we're talking about integration, cross-curricular learning, this is where those standards can come into play. We know we can always bring in literacy, that these things are, there are ways to do that. So we're going to kind of make that our entry point for as we continue with this webinar is to let's strip off the label for a minute and just talk about good teaching. Because in the end, the label doesn't matter. We're going to have to do certain things the way our schools or our institutions make us. But when you're the ones teaching, you're the ones instructing most of you. And so it is in your power to almost define that in your classroom. And so one of the misconceptions is robotics is solely in STEM. And if we just look at this in using the Ozobots as a technology tool, like we would any other device, computer, that kind of thing, then we strip away the STEM idea. It is not just for STEM teachers. It is not just for a STEM class or a special class, but can be integrated through in any classroom. If you are an ELA teacher, if you are a math teacher, there are ways to integrate this tool to hit your standards if you are required to hit standards, but also look at skill building. And also we understand that a lot of you probably already know some of this. A lot of you are educators who have done this for a while. So it's kind of just bringing that to the forefront and kind of making sure that we have that framing going into how do we think about using them. So we're not going to talk too much about theoretical foundations because you're like, I come on here to learn about theory. But just to keep in mind, educational theory is good foundation. And if we take that as our foundation, having students actively explore, having students create tangible items. Students are curious, they're questioning. This is the essence of education, problem solving, working together. That's what we want to focus on in terms of skill building. And then the content comes along with it. And then, so that's what we're going to talk about the rest of the time now is understanding that our framing is around skills. And then there's a way to, we're going to throw the content in there and make sure we're hitting standards and finding those doable ways to integrate it when we have a lot of other pressures, happening around us. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these. So I'm not sure to what extent each of these will relate to everybody, but you might have some colleagues or some friends in these other areas that you don't teach or work with students on. So just kind of take it, from a bigger perspective of how you might be able to integrate it across multiple. So from a middle school, secondary level, sometimes we get so much into the content and that is solely our focus. And we're like, no, this is extra. The robots are extra. We're not teaching computer science. I have to hit my science standards or my math standards or my ELA standards. And we get bogged down in that. And it really comes down to the creativity of the teacher to make creative lessons and find ways to integrate that, knowing that we're building skills along the way. So if you are in the sciences, one of the easiest ways, and I'm science, I was a science teacher, so my background is science. This is my love. So the easiest way to think about it is go through the context of science and engineering practices and working with data, modeling, communicating information, asking questions, making inferences, making guesses, trying it out, testing, all of that. So a lot of that is scientific process or design processes. And then that ELA connection in science and in math as well is that technical reading and writing. And finding ways to, as we're coding and giving the code, the instructions to the Ozobot, is to help students write detailed instructions. So by using the Ozobots to help students write better instructions, our scientific procedure instructions get that much more detailed and defined. So it helps with the writing skills in a science classroom. And then we have your physics. I mean, this is an easy in math and in science is we have motion. And so we can take data on the motion of the Ozobots. We can move them around. We have orientation. We've got speed, acceleration, all of the things that they can calculate. They can manipulate variables, graph. So all of that can come into physics. Some other ways, and you'll see this across some of the other content areas, is mapping and using your space in your classroom where perhaps there's a table or the floor and you have some type of diagram or, for instance, the periodic table. I don't know about you, but I had a very large, if you're a science person, a very large periodic table on my wall, and I would pull that down and utilizing the Ozobots moving, code it so that it's going to certain elements. And the students are working with those elements and learning the properties, et cetera. There's some other things on this slide. We're not going to go through all of them, but anything from chemical reactions and energy diagrams, same thing with human body and kind of tracing, it says on the slide, but blood flow, neural signals, almost like a flow chart. Cell City, we love the Cell City. That's a big one. And we even have some climate biomes and genetics. So you can always go back and kind of look at these examples. But I think we'll move on to math. Math, I spoke to math a little bit ago, but again, a lot of this can be algebraic expressions, functions, graphing, statistics, doing a lot of trials and geometry as it moves. There's angles. We can look at rotation. So there are those ways. I am not a math teacher, so I can't speak specifically to those things, but those would be some ideas in mathematics.
So I have a background as an ELA teacher. I taught middle school ELA. And I have to say, when I talk about teaching content with coding tools, usually my ELA and my social studies teachers are the most skeptical, but I promise you really can do it. So these are just some simple ways that you can bring in the Ozobots with your ELA standards. Because you've got to, when we have our diagrams or our plot, or, like I know in our seventh grade, we did the hero's journey through Greek mythology. All of those are ways you can have the Ozobot following a path or making choices or, um, following the logical steps. And it's really kind of fun, especially if you look at the bottom, the literary device challenge. Um, you know, the students can code and send the robot to a specific place, and then their partner has to, you know, find a way to use that literary device. And it's really interesting. And then for history, social studies, there are so many ways, again, using maps and timelines and looking at the way things branch from each other. So there's so many ways we can use our Ozobots to help our students connect, the stories we're telling in history or those concepts we're talking about in social studies to more concrete examples.
And muted myself. In the visual and performing arts, so I've a background in dance was my first degree, and it's such a great perspective when we think about the engineering design process or the design process. Those of you who are familiar with the engineering design process, if you're doing anything with engineering, you're using that design process. And I've worked with a lot of arts educators, and all we do is we take off that word engineering and it becomes the design process. For a dance educator, it's the choreographic process. So this is kind of off of Ozobots because I literally did this about an hour ago. I run a STEM club at my school, and we were using Blockly, which is what Ozobots uses, the block coding, but we were doing drones, but you could do it with Ozobots as well. And we're putting on a STEM night, and the students created a drone show choreography to music using the block coding. So they had to create codes, share their codes, figure out, go back and troubleshoot when something didn't work, try and get it to fit the music so that it would turn at certain phrasing. And it was awesome. Like, I wish I could show you the video, but it's the same thing with the Ozobots. When Jana and I used to teach at the same university, and with our pre-service teachers, this was one of the activities that we would do with them, and then they would try it out with their students in the classroom. But it's the same idea, is creating choreography out of the movement of the Ozobot. So that's a big one for dance. I gotta put in a few things for dance. We don't see that much in schools anymore, but in arts, regardless, we've got there's some art technique with looking at. This one says on here, Ozobots visit zones for shading, line, texture, and balance. Students create sketches or projects representing each. So in this case, it's having the Ozobot visit that, but who's to say that you couldn't attach a marker to an Ozobot and have it draw? So there's some things that we have to think a little bit outside of the box and see if there is something that we can do with the Ozobot that lends itself to maybe more exploration. We have music. So that's kind of where that pattern, rhythm, can we get it to maybe do some movement to the rhythm? Perhaps you can have it make music. It makes sounds. And also as it moves, there might be some way to have it make sounds as it's moving along its pathways. Okay, so we can I could talk about visual and performing arts all day.
So, again, thinking outside the box a little bit, there's even ways we can bring Ozobot into teaching foreign language or teaching English as a second language or, in for English language learners. So, using prompting, and again, we've got our maps and our diagrams and visiting those like spots on a paper where if it stops here you have to do the verb in the present tense. If it stops over here you have to conjugate the verb in the past tense. And exploring vocabulary, there's so much you can do with Ozobot when you start kind of thinking outside that box. And then even with PE and health, there's ways to bring Ozobot in, um, especially when you start using the Ozoblockly, you can actually have the Ozobot doing like a circuit of exercises or traveling through a maze. There's so many ways that it can look at how our body moves and how we, how we're creating physical health for ourselves. And then, obviously with a health, with the body systems and all of that. And the one of the ones I really like is that nutritional label breakdown. Um, that, because students don't always think about, yeah, I know how to read a label, but what does that actually mean when I read a label? And the Ozobots can help them stop and really, think critically about those labels.
Yeah. So before we go on to this and kind of come back to theoretical foundations, why don't we pause for some discussion? And part of that could be questions, if you have questions for us or to throw out to the group. But also you might already do some of this. And so if you already have tried some lessons or have had some success or have a different idea, please share. I think this is a great time to bring everybody's expertise into the mix because we don't know everything, So feel free to either do a chat or even you can come off of mute if you would like. Okay. While you're writing in your thinking, how about Jana? Well, let's go to the next slide. We'll give everybody a little bit more time to think of some questions or ideas if we have them. Because what I'd like to do is just bring it back to that idea. So if we're going to put some of these lessons that we've just talked about into this idea of best practices in teaching and learning, we have some examples. So for constructivism, this is kind of educational theory 101, back to Vygotsky. Oh, I know. Nobody wants to hear about that right now. But really the goal is with that is active exploration, collaborative learning, and with Ozobots, students are engaging in hands-on learning. They are experiencing it. They are trying things out. They are testing it. They are actively exploring something tangible in the moment and can make sense of that. Constructionism is when students are creating something. So there you go. We have design projects that are happening depending on how you utilize the Ozobots, if it is a design type of project. And those things we're going to talk about representation, different ways to represent information. And this would be one way to represent information. I talked a little bit about inquiry-based learning in the science context, but we also have that in the humanities. Inquiry standards are often in standards in history and social studies, just maybe different types of evidence or data. But this is one way to practice asking questions, logic. Is this gonna, if I do this, is this gonna happen? Testing it out when something's not working, going back and trying it again, checking variables. So that inquiry, that questioning, curiosity, figuring out why something's happening or not happening is part of that. Is anybody doing PBL? There's PBL, and project-based learning is another one of those that has many different versions. Um, and I know I was like, I cannot wait to read some of these. But if you're doing PBL, it's more than just a project. Is you usually in PBL, you're looking at real world scenarios, real world problems. The goal of that is to find something in your community, typically, or it doesn't have to be in the community, but somewhere where you're solving something that's actually going on. And in this case, it may not be utilizing the Ozobots to solve the world's problems, but you can use them to simulate and use them in different ways for designing reenactments as a part of the bigger project. So it might not be your end product, but it could be something that's utilized along the way to represent the information that's being learned in a project-based learning type of scenario. And then, of course, we have our 4 Cs. We got to love the 4 Cs. So, of course, we're doing creativity, collaboration, working together, critical thinking. Of course, we're problem solving and communication. Again, talking about what we're doing, sharing that with others, all of that. Okay, let's go back to the chat and see what your questions or thoughts are.
So there's been several awesome suggestions and ideas put into the chat. Some people have shared, some ways that they're using the Ozobots. And Jen pointed out that Ozobot can be a great random chooser. So I love that. And Michelle, I am totally stealing this idea of code to learn rather than learning to code. I'm totally stealing that. I'm just telling you now, I'm stealing it. Um, and so there's some really great suggestions here in the chat. So Sandra does ask us a question. She says, I tried 3D printing Ozobot pen holders in hopes of attaching markers, but they didn't seem to fit the bots, nor any markers I tried. Does anyone have any suggestions? So I will say, this sounds crazy, but sometimes you have to go a little old school. Rubber bands. So I know that sounds crazy, but because we do a lot of 3D printing here and we tried to, get all fancy with it, and I wound up going back to rubber bands. So
I love the idea, though, of mixing 3D printing with Ozobots, especially if you're in a very much a STEM classroom where you're utilizing all of those things and the students are learning all of those tools. What a great way to mix tools for learning. So that's awesome. And I would say stick with it, like keep trying until you figure it out. That's part of the beauty of STEM, and how many prototypes do you have to try? What a great lesson for students until somebody comes up with the right one. That's awesome.
that's great for, that resilience. And someone told me the gave me this phrase, and I just thought it was such a great way to talk about it, as productive struggle. So we need our students to struggle a little bit to, because we lean into that discomfort and that's where we grow. But we want it to be productive struggle, not just frustration. So I love that idea of productive struggle. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, Trudy is awesome science educator and STEM educator. She is amazing. Um, but part of why she and I work so well together is I come from more that ELA, you know, background, and she comes from more of that science background. And so the design thinking, you know, in science, they tend to call it engineering design process. When I was using it in ELA, we called it the design thinking process, but they very much overlap. So design thinking is design thinking, whether you're looking at it from an engineering design and from more of a math science perspective, or that design thinking process, more of a arts or humanities lens. We're still going through those steps and having that troubleshooting and prototyping. And so again, let's not get caught up in the labels, but focus on what we're actually doing.
Mhm. And if some of you get a chance, I mean, maybe some of you have the opportunity to work with your colleagues and create cross-curricular projects. What a neat way to utilize Ozobots across those areas. Again, kind of in our slides, we said, here's how you would use it in science. Here's how you would use it in math. But there are ways to use it as across, and it's kind of like getting together. I'm okay at literacy. I could not probably teach it as well as Jana could, but she can find those integration strategies of, okay, if I'm doing the Ozobots in my science classroom, I'm like, Jana, okay, how would this fit in? And it's just great then to have that. I know not all schools have the ability to do that, especially at high school level. It's a little bit harder to collaborate with people outside of your content area, depending on the schedules. But you find those, passing in the hallway, how you to figure it out. I also have another question. Um, in terms of using Ozobots, are you all choosing to use Ozobots? And so you're kind of an individual in your institution that's doing this, or was this something that was given to you from your administrator, your district, and they're kind of saying, here, you need to use these. Go learn. Because that's also another important part of this process is, number one, kudos for all of you being here, regardless of where it came from. Because you're learning and willing to learn more about it, whether it was directed at you or you're like, no, this is so cool. I just want to do it. Um, so if anybody is willing to just share that, I think that's just an interesting way to think about it, too. Because, yep, so what we're seeing a lot with STEM tools are it's either coming from like a library media department, that's what Jana used to do, and it's housed there, which is great. Um, but then it's how do you get everybody else to buy into it and use it beyond the library media specialist? And then they're sitting in your library, and it's how do you get them out of those spaces and across um, those areas. So if you're kind of the teacher leader or the instructional coach or the administrator in your building, that's another piece of this is how do you talk to your colleagues about utilizing them? A lot in my building, and I'm the principal, so I do my best to try and get my teachers to use these things. I don't force them, but we have open time to work with them. And then I have one teacher that tries something and then they have a chance to share. So I'm hoping that if you are using Ozobots, you have a chance to share that with your colleagues because then the next person wants to try it. Oh, that's so cool. Let me try that. Or the kids were talking about this. And they get really, it builds and it builds. It's nice to not be on an island. And I don't know how many of you are on an island in this case of trying some of this out. Great if you're not, but hopefully you can find those other people that are willing to engage with you. Yep, see, grants. Yep, love it. Awesome. Yep, universe. Oh, so Jana, there's somebody else
Yeah,
that's doing like
I
the
saw
loan
that.
program. I
I
love
just
those.
replied to
Mhm.
that because we do that here at the center as well. And it's amazing what a great partnership that's become.
Mhm.
So, um, so now that we've really kind of thought about, we talked a little bit about the how, but we really dug into the why. So let's go back to the how a little bit. So when we're introducing it to our classrooms, um, that open discovery time is so beneficial to students. And, our instructional time is precious, especially with our secondary students. But by giving them that time to just try and troubleshoot and figure out what works and what doesn't, I have discovered that that actually cuts down on some problems later on. Because when I've let the students loose to kind of um, dig through it on their own, when I give them a little more structured activity, um, they're way more comfortable. So even though, sometimes it seems hard to give up some of that instructional time for things like open discovery, you know, you got to weigh the benefits, right? And then Dr. Giasi used to teach the class that I now teach, and she came up with this awesome example of Simon Says. So I'm going to let her tell you about that.
Well, and then I just did the PBJ sandwich the other day with my students. Again, I get to actually try this stuff out in my own building, which is amazing. So if students are new to coding and like, how do you, and oftentimes this is at the lower levels, but I just did this with middle schoolers, is how do you get them to really understand what coding is without being afraid of it? And the easiest entry point is, and again, a lot of you probably already have some idea, have tried some of these things, but how do you get them to really just understand its instructions, input, output? At its most basic level, it is instructions for doing something. And so doing a Simon Says activity where if you know what Simon Says is, Simon says jump up and down, Simon says turn around. And so giving them some directions and sometimes not making it easy for them to understand. So, you know, going into that, how detailed do we need to be in our instructions to make sure that our robots do what we want them to? And if we're not specific enough, then they're going to struggle and not know what to do. And this happens all the time with Ozobots. If they don't understand a code, they just do whatever. And so with Simon Says, they get to learn about, okay, well, you told me to point or to turn. What was one of the, Jana, what was one of the instructions that's really
Oh,
vague?
so we have more than one door in the classroom where we teach this class. And so we would say face the door.
Yeah, and they wouldn't know what that is, or um, point or stand up and face forward. What's forward? We don't know. It's all about orientation. So that was kind of an entry point. The other one that I just did, if you don't have peanut allergies in your school, but if you're allowed to use peanut butter, this is often in a science classroom. We do this activity for writing science instruction, procedural instructions, and the kids tell you how to make a PBJ sandwich and they give you instructions, but oftentimes they leave out a lot of details. So then you're trying to make the sandwich according to their directions. So they get this idea of how important those instructions are. They get the idea of that there's an input, the directions, and an output, something happening in action. And at its a very basic level, that's what it is. So that's and it's fun. They're like, oh, I love peanut butter or jelly sandwiches or, something like that. So that's kind of one of those, how do we introduce it as a really simple idea and then get to the next level, whether that's color codes is the next level or Blockly is the next level. Either one. Management tips. Now, this is another place where those of you who have already done this or have done coding in your classroom or a lot of hands-on learning, this is where classroom management comes into play. Because if we truly are being creative, being collaborative, communicating, and critical thinking, there's a lot of things going on. We've got probably kids moving around the classroom. We have tools that we need to take care of. We have time management. We have expensive devices that we don't want them to break. So as a teacher, we all know that we have regular classroom rules, but there are always other things to think about when using Ozobot. So we're just kind of bringing that to the forefront. Again, if you have any suggestions from experience, please add that to the chat. But things like doing this in a centers or stations way, where kids are maybe have a task and doing a task at a station and maybe moving around the room so they get a chance to do different tasks. So kind of making these small little lots of so they don't get almost too bored. It gives them a lot of little things to try out before you might get into a longer project. Group collaboration, as we know, that is always a challenge. Our students are can be really interesting in their social development levels, and how they talk to each other. And we know there's some struggle with that going on. So again, we're teaching as a part of this and any other collaborative activity you're doing in your classroom, you're teaching them how to work with one another. So that, of course, has to come into the mix if they're going to do it in partners. If you are lucky enough to have one per person, A plus. That's amazing that you would have that many to do. But again, if we're trying to skill build, it's really nice to be able to put them into groups and have them work together and figure out how to come to consensus, how to brainstorm and come up with one idea um, together. Oh, I like this idea from Nathaniel, numbering the Ozobots, passing them out. Yep. So they do not pocket those guys. So numbering them is a great idea just for inventory. Absolutely. Having really clear prompts if you have some clear outcomes. Now, if it's just discovery and try some things, be clear on what that expectation is. But of course, things always go better when we're clearer, instructor. And then Jana, you want to talk about peer experts?
So we always have the issue of differentiation. And we have those students who really enjoy coding and are very, very comfortable with it. And so I would have a handful of students that would be like, but I already know how to do this. And so I'd be like, great, you're now the peer expert. So, I had a big thing in my class was ask three before me. So now they'd be like, Mrs. Gerard, and I'd be like, check with your peer expert. And so it gives them some more ownership. And so if you have a student that is, in danger of being bored or not feeling challenged, by making them the peer expert, it, they get to bring a whole nother level of skills into it. So, the peer experts can be very helpful.
I think one of the hardest things is for the kids who just like to play and mess, and they know they're supposed to be doing something on task, but they just want to do their own thing. I mean, obviously that's just something that you got to work on and figure out how to keep them. What are your on task rules and consequences for that? But I'll say number one, that in the middle school level in particular, that's probably the hardest thing is when you give them a task and they are off over here in La La Land and then not doing so. Management that way. I love having some friends come and help me. So if you have any support specialists or your librarian or your media specialist or your instructional specialist, that is a great time to have extra hands on deck so that you can manage all of the different things, anything hands-on, that they're doing. And we're just like, oh, how many times do we have to say, come on, get on task? What are we doing? And of course, all of this is to encourage experimentation. So yeah, sometimes that is good when they get off task is because they followed some other pathway. So part of that is, yes, you're supposed to be doing this activity and here's what the outcome is that we're supposed to have or whatever it is. But also listening to them, those kids who kind of go off center a little bit and looking at what they did, because sometimes they come up with some really cool things or reasoning behind, well, I found out it does this and I wanted to see what it does. It does. So it's almost that balance of keeping them on task and then also acknowledging their learning that they've actually discovered something else. I know it's hard when we have by the end of this period, we need to do this.
Michelle
Um,
says she likes to ask students to plan out on paper first, and I love that. Um, I have Girl Scout troops that come to the center to earn their badges, and generally, especially with the Girl Scout troops, I that is definitely a step I have them do is working together and planning out those steps before we actually even get hands on. So I love that. So, really quickly, we're just going to talk about differentiation with Ozobots and formative assessments with Ozobots through the lens of universal design for learning. So, I know a lot of you are familiar with this, so I don't want to dig too deep into it. But really, the three pillars of UDL are engagement, representation, and action and expression. And Ozobot fits so well into these pillars of UDL. So obviously, we're asking them to get hands-on and try things and experiments. We've got that engagement. And for representation, that gives us as the teacher multiple ways to present information to our students, be it images or maps or text or whatever. But the Ozobot helps us have those multiple means of representation. But then again, it gives students a different way to demonstrate their learning. So they have different ways under that action and expression piece of, having that formative assessment and using the Ozobots to have them demonstrate learning. So, I really love how the Ozobot fits in so well with all three pillars of UDL. Did you want to add anything, Trudy?
well, and especially if you are in a special education setting, UDL is one of the foundation. I mean, it's a huge part of special ed, but really it's now a part of all education where we're thinking about all of our different learners. So that's really, in this case, those abots do such a great job of allowing you to make adjustments and allow students to work where they're at on things, especially with using, I don't know, Jana, if you mentioned accessibility features,
That's next.
and then some of the, oh yes, and some of the other things. Sorry.
So no, you're fine. So a part of knowing the how is thinking about, how can we integrate Ozobots with what we already have. So Ozobots do integrate with Google Classroom and many other LMSs. We can use it with FigJam or other whiteboarding tools, and it does work well with interactive whiteboards. And what's great about um, the interactive whiteboard piece is that allows us to make some of this more accessible to students who it may not be accessible for in other ways. But one of the cool things about Ozobots is it will work with screen readers. So if you have a student that is using a screen reader, Ozobots will work with the screen reader. So I think that's a very, very cool thing. Um, and I wanted to point out that Ozobot does have Ozobot Classroom, which is free. You do have to create an account, but it is free. And there's this huge lesson and activity library as a resource that Ozobot provides us. And then
And
last
just
but
put it in the chat too. She
okay,
linked there.
and then last but not least is don't forget about social media. If are out there on social media, that is a great way to connect with other educators and hear about what what other people are doing and all of that. So the official Facebook group for Ozobot is Ozobot Academy, and it is a private group. You can ask to be added, and they'll get you added to that. So, whew, we just threw a lot of information at you guys. Um, what questions do you have for us? And again, here is the QR code and the URL to these slides if you want any of these resources.
Yeah, thank you for your input and your participation in giving your thoughts and ideas. I think, that's half of the learning here is getting ideas from others who have already tried some of this. Um, That's great. Because
Oh,
even
Denise.
Sandra said, or Sandra, sorry if I said
Yeah.
that wrong, being able to mix blocks from different Ozoblockly coding levels is another way to
Nice.
differentiate.
And Denise shared an activity for Earth Day because we're just about to Earth Day. So there's a bot cleanup challenge. So what a great idea
I
to
might be stealing that myself. Let me
yeah,
pull.
to bring in Ozobots and combine those with Earth Day. I love it. What other questions might you have for us? So I am going to go back to the very beginning. And my email is here, and Trudy's email is here. As you could probably tell, we love to talk about this stuff. So, if you have questions or, if we can help you in any way, please, please reach out to us. So I'm going to go ahead and stop